Hey everyone, here's your second set of notes for the weekend. All of this focusing on the heart. So in the first section here, I'm going to get you guys to go through labeling the structures of the heart. So use your textbook. And I've given you the list here down at the bottom to focus on. And what I would suggest doing once you get it labeled is just kind of go through and give a function for each of the structures. So for example, let's say if I was starting with the left atria here, um, so then you could put something like, the left atria is receiving oxygenated blood from the lungs and sending them to the left ventricle, sending to left ventricle. Right, so you've got some sort of function as to what each structure in the heart is doing, right? And in red, I've outlined all the different valves, right? Same valves for each different side. And you'll see there's lots of different names out there: mitral valves, semilunar valves, tricuspid valves, atrioventricular valves. Like some of them have multiple names. So focus on the names I've used down at the bottom. All right. So once you've done that, you can pause this video if you want, go through all of that, and then start the video to just kind of review how blood flows through the heart. And this again helps with your tracing of the pathways. Okay, so if you want to pause and then restart. Okay, so tracing our blood through the heart. So remember, this top blood vessel is referred to as the superior vena cava, that is coming from the head and shoulders, arms, upper portion of the body, and it's coming down and enters into the right atria. Down at the bottom, we have the inferior vena cava, and that's bringing blood from the lower extremities, right? Everything from your thoracic cavity, your abdominal cavity, and of course your lower limbs. All that blood returns into the right atrium from the lower side. So blood enters into the right atria, and the right atria sends it to the right ventricle, and then the right ventricle goes through the pulmonary valve into what's called the pulmonary trunk. All right, so this main section is the pulmonary trunk, which then splits again into left and right pulmonary arteries going to the lungs, right? And then on the way back, all right, coming back, we're in the pulmonary veins. All right, oxygen-rich blood enters into the left atrium, coming from the left lung, and over here from the right lung, coming in behind the heart and also entering into the left atria, which goes to the left ventricle. And then in behind the pulmonary trunk, the aorta comes out and it curves up and around the back of the heart. And then these branches here are going up to your subclavicle, your head, arms, etc. Right? So these are going upwards, and then the aorta bends around and goes behind the heart and goes down to the lower extremities. All right. And so coordinating all of that blood flow is what we call the cardiac cycle. And the cardiac cycle is all basically under the control of the heart itself. So it's actually separate from the nervous system, and it has its own control. So the sequence of pumping and filling the chambers of the heart is referred to as the cardiac cycle. I'll try and get my pen working here. Cardiac cycle. And so we'll go through the different phases and outline what's going on. So if we think about these different steps of the cardiac cycle, and you just think about your heart beating, right? So heart muscle has to contract, and that's going to push blood in particular directions. And then of course it has to relax in order for the chambers to fill up with blood. And so the action of contraction, this is what we refer to as systole. So when you think of when a doctor measures your blood pressure, and an average blood pressure reading might be 120 millimeters of mercury. So remember those units of pressure. over 80 millimeters of mercury. Well, these numbers correspond to systolic pressure. So that's when the ventricles are contracting. And remember, we talked about that the other day, where you feel your pulse when the blood is forced into those arteries. So that higher pressure reading is systolic, ventricles contracting. And that lower reading, 80 millimeters of mercury, is what we refer to as diastolic, in which case the heart muscle is relaxing and chambers are filling with blood. So that's sort of like a resting pressure. Okay, so breaking down the cardiac cycle, step one begins with diastole. And so that's basically the heart is relaxed, right? And chambers are filling. So heart is relaxed, or heart muscle is relaxed, and blood enters into the four chambers. Sorry, my pen, into the four chambers. So atria and ventricles. All right, and so these are outlined here in the steps showing atrial and ventricular diastole, step one. And then step two, you get atrial systole. Okay, so step two being atrial systole here. So that's the contraction of the atria, and they're sending blood down into the ventricles. All right, so systole, contraction of left and right atria. And this fills ventricles. So you got to remember that the ventricles are a significant greater volume of blood than the atria. So when diastole happens, the atrias will fill up very quickly, but the ventricles probably aren't completely full. So the action of atrial systole, the atria contract and send blood down into the ventricles, completely filling those ventricles. Okay, and then finally down here at the bottom, we have ventricle systole. And so step three here. So here we have the ventricles contract. I'm just going to slide up a little bit. Right, so ventricles contract. And what's interesting about the action, which we'll see when we talk about the electrical signals that are sent to cause these muscles to contract, there's long fibers that reach down into this heart muscle, down into the bottom. And what that does is it sends the signal down into the lower regions of the heart muscle to cause the heart muscle to contract from the bottom up. So it ensures that that blood is being pushed from the bottom up. It doesn't just contract in the middle. So ventricles contract from the bottom of heart muscle up and out of the heart. And that's the essential cardiac cycle. So split up into those three stages, and you can sort of see the time frame here at which each occurs, right? So making up, if you add these up, you've got roughly about 0.8 seconds through the entire cycle. And so that makes sense when you think about it. If you've got 0.8 seconds per cycle, and you multiply that by 60, well, you can think of, approximately, 48 to 50 beats per minute, right? When you think about your pulse. And remember what I said up at the top, your blood pressure is measured based on systolic over diastolic. And it varies widely among men and women. We can discuss that on Monday's class if you have questions. 120 millimeters of mercury over 80 millimeters of mercury for systolic over diastolic. Now, if we think about, the number of times your heart is beating in a minute, so every 0.8 seconds it's going through that cycle. Well, one contraction sends about 70 mils of blood. And so if you take that 70 milliliters of blood per second, you multiply by 60 seconds per minute, right? You are going to end up with something in the neighborhood of, I think it's over 5 liters, I'm not sure, but the volume of blood pumped per minute, and again, varies on size, but probably around 5 liters of blood. So think of a big 4-liter plastic milk jug, right? And add another liter to it. That's about how much blood your heart is moving every minute, right? Multiply that by 60, you've got 300 liters in an hour. Multiply that by 24, and I don't know, you've got what, 7,200 liters in a day. So your heart is working, pumping a lot of fluid nonstop all the time. So a little question to think about. What factors might influence your cardiac output? What might cause it to vary from one person to another? I'll let you think about that and we'll come back to it. Last thing I'm going to finish up here is just now talking about what drives that cardiac cycle. So it is electrical signals, but the cool thing is the heartbeat is intrinsic. That means all the electrical signals come from within the heart. Right? You could remove, I mean, if you've ever seen a video of that open heart surgery, when they're taking a heart out or replacing it with a new one, like that heart is beating all on its own. It doesn't need electrical signals from the central nervous system. So there is this tissue embedded within that cardiac muscle that works in the same manner as the electrical impulses that we talked about, action potentials in the nervous system. So it originates in the heart muscle itself. This means that the heartbeat is intrinsic, all right, and it operates without stimulation from the central nervous system. Okay, it begins with what is called the SA node or the sinoatrial node. And so this is a node of electrical tissue within the cardiac muscle up here in the top sort of left corner of the right atria, so top of right atria. And the SA node consists of specialized cardiac muscle. And you can look back to chapter 20 on your histology, where you could sort of see how it's a bit different than skeletal muscle, right? The way it has these junctions that connect those muscles, ensuring that those muscles are working together, right? So that muscle generates electrical signals. And the signal spreads throughout the tissue. So you can kind of see in this drawing, it's, in the back, all around, out through the front, spreading throughout that right atria, causing the atria to contract simultaneously. You can see this line goes all the way over to this side. And it hasn't drawn them all, of course, right? But just to show that that tissue, that electrical tissue spreads throughout both. So throughout both atria. Causing them to contract simultaneously. So once those electrical signals go out, they're tied to a second node down in the bottom right corner of the right atria, kind of between the left and right, and also the right atria, right ventricle, and the right atria, left atria, another node of tissue called the AV or atrioventricular. Atrioventricular node, which again, there's about that 0.1 of a second to delay just to ensure that the atria have fully emptied, right? All right, this ensures the atria contract and empty I was just looking previously, I had close here, but the atria don't really close. So the atria contract and empty before the ventricles contract. All right. So once that electrical signal enters down into the AV node, then here's where I was talking about those fibers reach down into, so they don't cause contractions starting up here. They reach down and they attach to these Purkinje fibers. So fibers of the AV node travel to the base of the septum, right? Where they spread and connect with these Purkinje fibers, which technically should be capitalized, named after somebody. Good gosh, my pen is on fire. And then those Purkinje fibers transmit the electrical signal to the cardiac muscle, causing them to contract from the bottom up and empty your ventricles into the corresponding blood vessel. Right ventricle into your pulmonary trunk, left ventricle into your aorta. All right, so that's it. Couple questions here down at the bottom to think about. Is your heart rate always the same? What would cause it to change? What's the process? Think about this in your lab, and also think about it, from the perspective of what influences the respiratory rate. All right, enjoy the rest of your weekend.